A banker in Florence could quiet a war with a letter, and a printer in Antwerp could ignite one with a hidden page. The Renaissance dazzled with painting, sculpture, and new learning, yet beneath the galleries and lectures moved tight circles that preferred lamplight to the square. Patrons gathered secretaries, scholars formed private academies, confraternities counted votes behind closed doors, and councils learned to rule with whispers as well as decrees. These were not legends, but working networks with rules, oaths, and ledgers. The Medici ran a private chancery that turned patronage into policy. Venetian magistrates guarded the Republic with sealed ballots. Humanists curated texts in salons that felt like ministries, and underground presses sent ideas across borders faster than armies. Jesuit colleges shaped minds for service. Rosicrucian manifestos promised an invisible brotherhood of reform, and navigators, cryptographers, and natural philosophers traded ciphers and charts in rooms that did not advertise their addresses. In this episode, we follow the people who mastered quiet power and the methods that still shape our world, from coded correspondence to selective disclosure, and from ritual honor to disciplined education. As we open those doors together, please like the video and subscribe to Ominous History for more, and know that we greatly appreciate your support. 1500 AD. What makes a Renaissance secret society? The Renaissance birthed circles that preferred doors to be closed and candles to be shaded. Patrons gathered trusted secretaries, humanists met in private rooms, and lay fraternities wrote rules that outsiders never saw. These were not tavern tales dressed in silk. They were disciplined committees that turned oaths into action and action into power. The first step in understanding them is to strip away the romance and look at structure. Admission by sponsorship, rules written in guarded copies, and sanctions that hurt when broken. Power in these groups lived in channels that looked ordinary at first glance. A script of bylaws, a purse controlled by 3 hands, a clerk with a tiny seal. A circle that controlled money could shape the mood of a city. A circle that controlled knowledge could shape the minds that ran a court. The quietest tool of all was time. A vote delayed at the right hour could suffocate a rival proposal without a single shout. Notable figures orbit these rooms. Secretaries who kept sovereigns informed, patricians who could smile while saying no, scholars whose patrons lifted them to the center of debate. Their names appear in letters and account books because these societies left footprints in the paperwork that kept states alive. A reader tracing those tracks today finds that the people who knew how to write the rules often knew how to bend them. The darker allegations almost always follow the money and the messages. Rivals claimed that debt lists doubled as levers, that confessional notes became career files, and that satire served as a blade aimed at reputations. Whether every story is true matters less than the pattern they reveal. Secrecy adds weight to ordinary favors and turns them into obligations. The modern echo is hard to miss. Encrypted chats, inner cabinets, alumni boards, and private foundations all rely on the same grammar of trust, gatekeeping, and selective disclosure. The Renaissance did not invent secrecy, yet it taught European elites how to run it as a system, and that lesson has never been forgotten. 1469 AD Medici Segreto and the private chancery. Florence admired beauty in stone and cloth, yet its real marvel was an information machine hidden in plain sight. The Medici Segreto was the inner office that handled the family's most sensitive business. Letters arrived folded tight, accounts were balanced by hands that rarely slipped, and messengers carried news along routes known only to a few. This was where patronage became policy, and policy became profit. The powers of this inner circle came from control of flows, credit to guildmasters, dowries to knit families, salaries to scholars, and loans to rulers who forgot that debts have memories. The private chancery coordinated who received help, who waited, and who was quietly told to seek fortune elsewhere. A list of names signed with neat flourishes could move councils without any need for public debate. Notable members worked at desks rather than thrones. Cosimo de' Medici set the tone of calm authority. Lorenzo de' Medici mixed tact with daring. And secretaries such as Bartolomeo Scala and Niccolo Michelozzi turned ideas into perfectly timed letters. Their talent was not only elegant prose, it was the selection of the one sentence that would make a partner act and a rival hesitate. Contemporaries whispered about darker arts. A ledger with sensitive loans could be read aloud in the wrong hall, so a prudent magistrate voted with his friends before anyone asked why. Gifts to street captains kept festivals peaceful and also kept the right banners visible. A notary who did not love the family found his archives oddly inspected for errors, while a judge who loved them discovered how easily fines could vanish. Whether called influence or pressure, the effect was the same. Choices bent toward the house that paid on time. The legacy of this office is visible in every modern inner cabinet and political kitchen. Chiefs of staff, trusted fixers, and senior clerks who coordinate money, messaging, and favors are heirs to this Florentine craft. The Medici Segreto proved that in a city of voices, the quietest room can decide the loudest outcomes. 1478 AD, Florentine Platonic Academy. At a villa north of Florence, a small fellowship made philosophy fashionable and power fluent. The Platonic Academy under Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico did not run elections or regiments. It ran taste at the highest level. Members read Greek with enthusiasm, translated ancient authors with grace, and argued that beauty and virtue belonged in the same breath. The Academy's control was cultural, and culture tugs on law more than most laws tug on culture. Their powers flowed through gates that looked like salons but worked like ministries. Access to rare manuscripts, introductions to princely patrons, and influence over which ideas seemed respectable in court circles. When a text received a Ficino preface and a Medici dedication, it did not simply exist. It arrived with a guard of honor. Notable names were luminous. Ficino played the lyre and the translator at once. Pico dazzled with questions that leaped from logic to myth. Angelo Poliziano stitched scholarship to poetry so well that rulers wanted him at supper. Lorenzo de' Medici watered the roots with stipends that kept pens moving and candles burning. This constellation gave the Academy a reach that far exceeded the headcount at any single table. Rivals accused the circle of keeping certain doctrines for private ears. Christian Kabbalah and Hermetic echoes were said to be discussed more boldly in rooms where only friends listened. In the rough world of university disputations, the Academy also learned to sculpt reputation. A cutting dedication could end a career, while a generous preface could build one. Reputation became a currency that never left a trail of coins on a floor. The Academy's afterlife is everywhere in the modern seminar. Curated reading lists, invitation-only colloquia, and advisory boards that decide which ideas win grants all descend from this model. The Platonic Academy taught elites to see learning as a club that could welcome or exclude with a smile, and that is a skill many institutions still practice. 1560 AD, Accademia Secretorum Naturae in Naples. In Naples, a brilliant host named Giambattista della Porta convened an academy devoted to the secrets of nature. Members experimented with mirrors, plants, magnets, and stage illusions, then defended their notes with rules of secrecy. The gathering mixed earnest science with a taste for the theatrical, which made princes curious and censors uneasy. It was both laboratory and mask, and the combination attracted attention. The powers of this society came from method and mystique. By enforcing procedures and encouraging replication, they could claim authority when others only had anecdotes. By requiring discretion, they could decide when to demonstrate a marvel and when to keep it in a locked notebook. That mix of proof and privacy is intoxicating in any age. Della Porta stood at the center like a conductor who knew every instrument. Physicians from courts, noble amateurs with money for apparatus, and talented artisans with strong hands all found a place in the circle. Their collaboration created devices that entertained guests and techniques that impressed patrons. A prince who watched a mirror reveal a hidden message began to imagine what else a mirror might reveal. Rumor gilded the academy with shadow. Rivals claimed that some optical tricks were repurposed for surveillance, that coded recipe books concealed trade secrets meant to starve competitors, and that court entertainments carried lampoons aimed with deadly accuracy. Even if half untrue, such charges show how quickly science becomes leverage when patrons learn that knowledge can amuse and intimidate at the same time. The Academy's legacy can be seen in modern research groups that embargo results until patents are ready, and in security communities that share proofs with insiders but not with the street. The lesson from Naples is blunt. A discovery is power when you control who sees it and when they see it. 1582 AD, Venetian Council of Ten and State Inquisitors. Venice wore ceremony like a crown, yet its real crown was a council that met behind doors marked with silence. The Council of Ten with the State Inquisitors formed a compact core of governance that handled espionage, sabotage, and plots. It was not a club in the social sense. It was a fortified room of state. Their powers were terrifying because they were legal and hidden at once. Secret ballots, sealed orders to arrest, exile decisions carried by gondola, and quiet control over economic licenses and embargoes. The council could destroy a faction and then dine without raising a voice. Citizens learned to speak respectfully of men whose faces they barely saw. Notable members rotated from the patriciate, which made the council a school where families learned to manage emergencies with ice-cold calm. The Inquisitors of State became a byword across Europe for focused efficiency. Their triumphs rarely appeared in public because a perfect operation leaves no residue but silence. Allegations of dark practice chase any body with that much reach. Anonymous denunciations could be forged by enemies. Black files were said to include affairs and debts of patricians who talked too freely. There were even tales of poison and velvet execution, which fit the mood of a city that made secrecy into art. The records speak more softly. Economic pressure through licensing hurt worse than a dagger when a rival's fortune depended on the salt trade or the glass furnaces. The enduring impact of the Ten is visible in every national security council that meets with locked phones and printed agendas stamped confidential. Venice taught states to carve out a compartment where necessary acts are done without applause, and once created, such compartments rarely shrink. 1545 AD, Scuole Grandi of Venice. Venice filled its calendar with glittering processions, yet the institutions that paid for those candles were the Scuole Grandi, elite lay confraternities with strict membership and secret ballots. They ran hospitals, funded dowries, and commissioned masterpieces, but they also ran closed chapters where policies were set and careers were made. Charity and discipline walked hand in hand. The powers of a scuola were concrete. Treasuries large enough to rescue neighbors during plague years, courts that punished members who broke rules, and influence over which artists and architects won the biggest commissions. Because membership cut across family lines, a scuola could balance rivalries that would wreck an ordinary office. Leading patricians sat in these halls, sometimes in more than one, and their cross-membership created a web of obligations that endured for generations. A rising merchant who earned admission gained not only prestige but also allies willing to sponsor bids, write letters, and shield missteps. In a city of water, the Scuole were dry ground where careers could be built brick by brick. The shadows were real. Vote trading for magistracies kept certain families on top. Blacklists quietly ensured that artisans who defied a scuola's officers found fewer buyers. Dowry funds sometimes steered marriages toward political ends, and a member who bucked a chapter decision discovered how quickly friends became busy elsewhere. These were not crimes in any simple sense. They were the private costs of belonging to a machine that believed in order. Modern nonprofit boards and endowed charities inherit both the grace and the grit of this model. Endowments can achieve miracles of public good, yet they also concentrate quiet influence in rooms where ballots are counted without an audience. Venice shows the double edge clearly and without apology. 1510, Compagnia della Calza. Before a festival thrilled the lagoon, a youth society had already decided who would shine and who would watch. The Compagnia della Calza gathered patrician young men into squads with emblems, mottos, and a taste for staging. They seemed playful to strangers and very serious to Venetians. Behind a mask stood a curriculum in influence. Their powers were social, yet consequential. They scripted spectacles that shaped public mood, they mentored one another into offices, and they gained protected access to elder patricians who judged talent by grace under pressure. A brilliant pageant could mend a factional fracture better than any speech. Names were drawn from the highest houses, and membership became a visible sign that a youth had both promise and sponsors. Masters of ceremony learned logistics that later turned into naval planning or diplomatic finesse. To command 1,000 lanterns on short notice is to understand supply better than many treasurers. The darker talk concerned backstage games, satirical roles assigned to rivals, casting choices that humiliated ambitious men, and private assignations used to lock down alliances. A mask can offer refuge for kindness and also cover for calculation. The Calza learned how to polish reputations and how to tarnish them with the same kit of props. Their modern heirs are culture clubs and leadership programs that groom future elites through performance and service. The important lesson is not that theater manipulates, it is that theater trains, and training in social management can become a lifetime license to steer crowds without raising one's voice. 1538 AD, the Spirituali, within the highest levels of church life, a discreet network explored reform with caution and courage. The Spirituali were not a sect in the street. They were a fellowship across Rome and northern courts centered on spiritual renewal and careful scholarship. They believed that doctrine and conscience could be argued with charity even when tempers burned. Their powers lay in access and persuasion. Cardinals with open minds, learned lay patrons, and correspondents who could carry arguments from a chapel to a chamber in the same afternoon. Because their letters circulated among people who signed edicts, an idea tested at a supper could become a policy before morning. The roster includes Gasparo Contarini with his humane statecraft, Reginald Pole with his royal blood and contemplative tone, and Vittoria Colonna, whose gifts and friendships warmed many rooms. These figures brought together circles that normally avoided each other, then protected the space for conversation with their reputations. Enemies accused them of shielding friends from censure and of promoting ideas too bold for pulpits. Confessional conversations were said to flow into career advice, and a penitent who held office might learn how to vote from a confessor who cared for his soul. The charge of blackmail misses the mark here, yet the charge of leverage lands. A trusted advisor can steer decisions more deftly than any threat can. The Spirituali left a legacy of tone rather than a brand. Polite, precise, and patient argument is a power in itself, and the quieter victories of conscience still trace their origin to rooms where well-read believers refused to turn opponents into enemies. 1520 AD, Alumbrados of Spain. Across Castile, small groups met to seek inner illumination that required no spectacle and little ceremony. The Alumbrados valued silent prayer and direct experience of grace, which placed them under suspicion in a century that feared religious chaos. Their gatherings were simple and intensely guarded, a style that made surveillance difficult and rumor easy. Their powers were those of intimacy. Teachers who traveled from household to household, lay patrons who offered bread and spare rooms, and followers who passed lessons by heart rather than by page. In a village world, such a network could grow under the very eyes of officials who never learned the language of its signals. Names in the records include Isabel de la Cruz and Pedro Ruiz de Alcaraz, with later witnesses describing circles that looked like family meetings to outsiders. Servants at court carried news of devotions and also warnings of raids, which gave the movement a small yet effective early warning system. Inquisitorial files accuse them of secrecy oaths, coded phrases, and recruitment among servants who could open doors or misdirect searches. A more painful theme is the trade in silence. An official who hinted at a raid might receive quiet thanks, and a neighbor who threatened to report a prayer could be met with a gift. None of this makes heroes or villains. It reveals how fragile people protect what they love. The modern echo is the language of privacy in faith. The right to meet quietly, to believe without permission, and to pray without an audience still carries the weight of those years. The Alumbrados remind us that secrecy can be a refuge and not only a weapon. 1496 AD, Converso Crypto-Judaism networks. Iberian families who accepted baptism did not always abandon memory. Crypto-Jewish households preserved rites in small gestures that could be folded into daily life. Recipes without pork, candles lit on certain evenings, and blessings whispered so softly that only a child at the table could hear. The network was not an organization so much as a promise across generations. Their powers were the obvious tools of survival: kinship, commerce, and caution. Cousins arranged apprenticeships that doubled as safe passage to friendlier towns. Merchants bought and sold through trusted partners who valued loyalty as much as price. The house itself became a sanctuary, and the calendar hung on the wall became a codebook. Notable families appear in trial records and in flight lists more often than in letters, because letters were dangerous. The bravery of mothers who kept a candle in a bowl inside a cupboard taught children that identity can live in a breath. Men of trade who took risks for distant relatives turned business into kinship with accounts that could be closed only with a hug. Abuses and exploitation were real. Officials and neighbors learned that hush money might be available if an accusation was threatened. Informers who wanted to settle a grudge whispered charges that could not be disproved because innocence keeps no register. Some priests and judges showed mercy. Others discovered that property seized from the condemned balanced accounts better than honesty did. The legacy that endures reaches beyond any single faith. The concept of conscience in law, the demand that homes be respected as private spaces, and the defense of minority practice all carry the weight of these hidden lives. When modern governments debate privacy, they echo prayers once spoken in kitchens by people who learned to keep love quiet. 1523 AD Inquisition familiars and informant webs. The tribunals of faith did not work alone, and that fact changed the texture of daily life across the peninsula and beyond. Who were the familiars? They were lay auxiliaries sworn to serve the Inquisitors, armed with licenses, cover stories, and the quiet certainty that their testimonies would be heard. Their strength came from proximity to rumor as much as from law, since markets, guilds, and parish doors all opened to people who looked like neighbors. A society that recruits watchers from inside the crowd learns to doubt its own echo. Their powers were built into procedures that prized anonymity and speed. A familiar could file a sealed report, attend a search, or carry an order that bypassed local notables who once mediated disputes. Property seizures after convictions created a pipeline of estates and inventories that changed hands with unsettling efficiency. When a legal system lets secret testimony collide with forfeiture, the ledger can become a weapon sharper than any blade. Notable participants rarely sign their names in bold letters, which is exactly how a working informant network should look if it intends to last. Clerks in busy towns, stewards in noble houses, and traveling merchants all supplied knowledge in exchange for safety, favors, or the simple relief of being seen as loyal. In this world, a porter with a memory could change a destiny, and a sacristan with a cousin in the Chancery could pull a thorn from a friend's foot. Allegations of misuse multiplied wherever jealousies thrived. A rival could be reported for private conversations that no one could verify, and a debtor could vanish behind a wall while his warehouse went to auction. Families learned the price of silence when a relative begged them to pay for a softer sentence, and neighbors discovered that whispers sometimes paid better than wheat. In the shadows of these choices, the difference between zeal and score settling often dissolved. The legacy that remains is a lesson about secrecy in law that still matters today. Anonymous tips can save lives, yet unchecked secrecy corrodes trust, so a community must decide how much darkness it will tolerate to avoid a different kind of night. 1520 AD Fugger Inner Partnership and the Court Lobby. Europe's most powerful bankers controlled mines, fleets, and calendars, and they did it with a partnership agreement few ever read. Who were the Fuggers? They were a family firm in Augsburg whose closed circle of partners financed rulers, supplied metals, and managed credit for princes who spent faster than they counted. The key to their command was not only gold, it was information that arrived before anyone else knew it existed. Their powers flowed through monopolies and concessions that transformed loans into policy. A contract for copper in Tyrol or quicksilver in Spain became a lever on royal appointments and imperial elections, and a promise to roll a debt forward became a leash that princes felt around the wrist. When the firm advanced cash for a campaign, the budget of a continent quietly shifted. The question to ask is not how much money they had, but how many decisions their money made. Notable figures include Jacob the Rich and Anton, who mastered the art of being indispensable while pretending to be ordinary. Agents sat in diets and courts, mingling with envoys and counting the smiles of ministers the way a shopkeeper counts coins. A letter from a mine manager in the mountains could steer a conversation in a palace 2 weeks later, and that is the speed at which empires lean. Dark accusations arrived with every triumph. Bribery during imperial elections became a rumor that refused to die, and rivals claimed that the firm used exclusive supply contracts to strangle competitors who dared to sell to the wrong buyer. A ruler who fell behind on interest learned that favors grow expensive when the next disbursement depends on the next signature. Blackmail did not need to be voiced when a notebook held the sums that would shame a sovereign. Their influence endures whenever private finance underwrites public rule. Central banking, sovereign debt markets, and the quiet lobby that moves between finance and cabinet all show the old pattern. The Fuggers proved that numbers can sit on a throne without ever wearing a crown. 1614 AD Rosicrucian circles and the Invisible Brotherhood, a set of strange books, promised a hidden fellowship that could renew learning and religion at once, and readers across the German lands leaned closer. Who were the Rosicrucians, as imagined by those manifestos? They were an invisible brotherhood devoted to reform through piety, experiment, and allegory, a fraternity that invited the worthy to seek without ever naming a lodge. The allure came from a claim that transformation could be organized in secret and unveiled on cue. Their powers were largely symbolic yet potent, because symbols move crowds long after swords fall silent. The manifestos encouraged scholars to imagine collaboration without hierarchy, to share discoveries in code, and to judge reputation by deeds rather than titles. In an age of confessional war and tight censorship, the promise of an unseen college felt like fresh air in a room that had grown stale. Notable names gather at the edges rather than the center. Johann Valentin Andreae would later frame the publications as a moral fiction with a reformist heart, while Michael Meyer traveled between courts with an alchemical pen that wrote music as easily as medicine. Printers, pastors, and natural philosophers all joined the conversation and created a community that existed wherever the books were read. Detractors saw manipulation where admirers saw inspiration. Critics accused promoters of staging a hoax to lure the gullible, while fearful preachers warned that secret initiations and mystical diagrams concealed heresy. Pamphlets threatened to expose imposters, and pamphlets replied with riddles that raised the temperature but not the clarity. The most interesting charge was not heresy but ambition, that the aura of membership could be used to blackball enemies and reward friends without any court to appeal to. The Rosicrucian moment taught Europe that an idea can wear the clothes of a society and still wield real influence. Learned societies, open science movements, and even modern online communities inherit the dream of a brotherhood that changes the world without a fixed address. 1536 AD Paracelsian brotherhoods in medicine. Doctors and apothecaries, who trusted fire and salt more than balance and humors, formed small circles that guarded recipes like jewels. Who were the Paracelsians? They were followers of Paracelsus, who believed that chemistry could cure where tradition failed, and they organized around laboratories rather than lecture halls. The appeal was simple to state and hard to ignore. If a tincture helps a miner breathe, a patient does not ask which author blessed the bottle. Their powers were woven into practice. A master with a furnace could produce remedies others could not, and a shop with access to rare minerals could refuse supply to rivals who mocked the new craft. Courts hired iatrochemists to tend precious bodies, which in turn gave those practitioners prestige that spilled into print and patronage. Once a prince praises your pill, a professor's frown matters a little less. Names that recur include Oswald Kroll with his physician's eye for method and Daniel Sennert, who argued across the bridge between tradition and change. Workshops invented devices to regulate heat and air, and notebooks recorded failures alongside successes because a failed cure is also a clue. The culture of replication grew in these rooms, and replication turns promise into practice. Rivals accused Paracelsians of monopolizing recipes and destroying reputations with carefully orchestrated demonstrations where opponents were set up to fail. The ugliest pamphlets alleged poison, yet the more credible attacks focused on secrecy that kept knowledge within a circle while selling to the suffering outside it. When a brotherhood sells cures but not methods, envy and suspicion both multiply. The legacy of these circles lies in modern pharmacy and the research clinic, where controlled disclosure, careful trials, and guarded intellectual property are normal. The Paracelsian habit of mixing experiment with secrecy shaped a path that still runs through every lab where results are timed to a patent clock. 1563 AD Family of Love. A merchant could pass you on a street in Antwerp and belong to a society you would never see. Who were the Family of Love? They were followers of Hendrik Nicholas, who prized inner rebirth, quiet conduct, and a discipline of concealment that kept meetings small and records scarce. Their strategy was not confrontation, but endurance, which has a way of frustrating officials who want a spectacle to chase. Their powers were social and commercial at once. Members traded with one another across borders, married within friendly circles, and sheltered travelers in homes where the table was always set. Printed tracts used pseudonyms, and correspondence used code names so that arrests would lead nowhere. People who share money and meals over years grow strong without noise. Notable figures begin with Nicholas himself, then blend into a catalog of artisans, shopkeepers, and a few well-placed friends who valued peace over display. English members existed within respectable trades, and their integrity made them look like pillars in towns where scandal could ruin a livelihood. This respectability formed a shield that law rarely pierced. Opponents accused the group of economic favoritism, court infiltration, and calculated invisibility that protected members while frustrating magistrates. Critics insisted that secrecy hides rot, and some pamphleteers wrote that merchants who refused to gossip must be hiding more than prayer. The darker suggestion was quiet blacklisting of those who cheated a brother or exposed a meeting. A man who crosses a network built on trust often learns how lonely a city can feel. The Family of Love left a trace in later arguments for toleration and in the idea that religious life may flourish without public rites. A group that chooses discretion over shouting reminds modern audiences that freedom of conscience includes the freedom to be less visible. 1568 AD Huguenot underground churches. France learned the art of worship without walls when pressure rose, and that instruction came from pastors who refused to vanish. Who were the Huguenots in their underground phase? They were reformed congregations that met by night, printed by candle, and moved as families rather than as mobs. The wonder is not that they suffered. The wonder is that they kept singing. Their powers were based on logistics and memory. A field assembly required lookouts, couriers, and carts staged at safe distances, while a secret press demanded paper, type, and a route to readers that outran patrols. The congregations built schedules that read like coded timetables, and they taught children to memorize psalms so that a confiscated book would not end the hymn. Notable leaders include Antoine de Chandieu, who organized across provinces while refusing anger, along with noble patrons who turned barns into chapels and cellars into bunkers for books. Women moved news with baskets and smiles, and men who owned no sword learned to carry a letter through 5 checkpoints. Grassroots engineering kept the gospel breathing. Enemies accused the underground of stockpiling arms, coordinating with foreign ambassadors, and leaking stories to push royal councils toward compromise. The case for arming remains debated, yet the use of information as a weapon is as old as politics. A well-timed leak can rescue a village with fewer tears than a volley. In this landscape, blackmail was less useful than exposure, and exposure arrived in packets of paper that crossed borders like birds. The diaspora of these churches seeded refugee networks that later shaped banking, crafts, and education from London to the Cape. The underground taught a lasting lesson. A community that practices mobility, literacy, and mutual aid can restart itself wherever the road ends. 1535 AD Anabaptist Cells. Across the empire, small groups gathered around kitchen tables to preach a second baptism and a first loyalty to conscience. Who were the Anabaptists in their cell phase? They were artisans and farmers who believed that faith belonged to adults and that a church could be built without swords or salaries. The radical simplicity of that stance made kings frown and neighbors stare. Their powers lay in the portability of their practice. A meeting required bread, a bucket, a few voices, and a promise to remain calm when the door shook. Networks grew through marriage, apprenticeship, and travel passes that were copied and lent with care. When a preacher moved, the map of hope shifted with him, and followers learned new roads as they learned new psalms. Names that matter include Menno Simons, whose patient teaching gave coherence to scattered flocks, and a host of unnamed women who kept houses open and food ready when flight arrived without warning. The organizing principle was not a charter, but a rhythm of hospitality that could be taught in an hour and lived for a lifetime. Authorities condemned sedition after the Nightmare of Munster, and informers were rewarded for causing arrests that courts could celebrate. Entrapment stings used false seekers to request baptism, and then the raid would come at dawn. Some survivors later wrote that the worst wound was not prison, but betrayal by a face that had smiled at prayer. Trust, once broken, asks long years to mend. The enduring imprint of these cells appears in free church traditions and in the legal language of religious liberty, which insists that small groups may assemble without fear. The memory of men and women who chose quiet conviction over noisy safety still pricks the conscience of anyone tempted to confuse peace with compliance. 1549 AD Society of Jesus Colleges and Sodalities. A new order promised disciplined study, global missions, and spiritual exercises that trained the will like a craft. Who were the Jesuits in their explosive Renaissance growth? They were priests and brothers who built schools where future ministers and counselors learned Latin, logic, and leadership, and they anchored these schools with lay sodalities that brought ordinary people into regular service. The engine ran on formation as much as on prayer. Their powers came from curriculum and correspondence. A college shaped habits for life, while letters from missions and courts created a web of insight that few monarchies could match. Confessors to rulers heard burdens that no secretary would ever hear, and teachers in cities learned which families would matter 20 years later. Influence grew in concentric circles around classrooms. Notable names include Ignatius of Loyola, whose constitutions turned zeal into method, Francisco Suarez, who taught thinkers how to split hairs without losing charity, and Robert Bellarmine, who argued with statesmen while keeping a scholar's tone. Alumni lists read like a directory of future judges and ministers, which is exactly what a school of stature wants to print. Rivals accused the order of steering princes from the confessional, running quiet intelligence networks, and staging theater to win culture wars. The legend of the Black Robe shadowed real achievements in learning and service, and the debate about power never quite fell silent. A confessor who knows a ruler's fears does not need to issue commands, and a teacher who trains a generation does not need to take a seat in parliament. The legacy appears in global education that pairs rigor with service, and in the continuing argument about how independent schools and advisors shape public outcomes. The order's method taught Europe that a syllabus can alter a nation more gently and more deeply than a statute can. 1586 AD Walsingham's Intelligencers. England learned the cost of letters when Sir Francis Walsingham taught the crown to read secrets for a living. Who were his intelligencers? They were codebreakers, couriers, double agents, and patient watchers who turned the kingdom into a nervous system with eyes at every crossing. The signature tool of the office was the opened letter, and the signature habit was to arrive at a conclusion before an enemy reached the port. Their powers were administrative rather than theatrical. budgets to pay informants, authority to search presses, and warrants to stage controlled plots that revealed networks rather than single names. The team around Thomas Philippes read cramped cipher and learned to smell hesitation in ink, while fieldmen tracked travelers through taverns and tide tables. When the file is a weapon, the safest soldier is a clerk. Notable allies included Anthony Bacon, who supplied intelligence through a family web, as well as diplomats who learned to ask one more casual question at exactly the right dinner. The service lived by patience under boredom, which is the true test of a professional. A week of nothing can teach a mind to miss the crucial half-sigh that marks a lie. Accusations of entrapment, honey traps, and public theater at trials followed every major case, and some charges were well earned. To spring a plot at noon after feeding it at dawn is to walk a line between protection and provocation, and a state that lives by interception must learn to justify itself with more than applause. Blackmail in this world often took the form of a choice between a signed confession and a family spared a ruinous fine, and choices made in such rooms leave bruises that do not show. Modern intelligence agencies trace roots to this method of mixed code work and human sources, and the ethical headaches remain the same. A free country must watch its watchers without blinding them, and that careful supervision is work that never ends. 1577 AD, John Dee's Mathematical and Angelic Circle. At Mortlake, a library breathed like a living thing, and its keeper organized the world with numbers, maps, and a restless curiosity. Who were John Dee's friends and allies? They were navigators, cryptographers, brass instrument makers, and learned visitors from across Europe who found in one house an academy without a charter. The center of gravity was not a throne, but a desk piled with charts. Their powers came from calculation and collection. A perfect table of declinations could save a voyage, while a cipher that frustrated a rival embassy could save a life. Dee advised on routes to empire and taught pilots to think like mathematicians, which is how a coastal nation becomes an ocean power. The boundary between scholarship and statecraft grew very thin at this address. Notable correspondents included Gerardus Mercator, who sent maps that redrew the imagination, and court patrons who learned that a page of numbers can be more persuasive than a speech. Edward Kelly entered the story with scrying sessions that fascinated some and horrified others, and his presence guaranteed that curiosity and controversy would walk together. Enemies alleged espionage under the mask of learning and whispered that angelic conversations hid attempts to extract secrets from the powerful. Dee's marginal notes became clues for both admirers and doubters who wanted proof that the library was a recruiting office. The notion that cipher keys could be embedded in glosses appealed to minds that trusted puzzles more than common sense. The afterlife of this circle is most visible in the fusion of science, navigation, and cryptology that still anchors national strength. When mathematicians teach a maritime power how to measure the world, the shoreline of possibility moves outward faster than the tide. 1558 AD, underground printers and book smuggling fraternities. A book that the law forbids often travels faster than a book that a clerk approves, and the Renaissance proved it page by page. Who were the underground printers and the smuggling fraternities that carried their work? They were pressmen who could disassemble a shop before dawn, stationers who memorized river routes as if they were psalms, and colporteurs who tucked folded quires into crates of cloth. Their fellowship was not announced with banners, yet it functioned like a guild that lived between shadows and storefronts. The first thing to grasp is their discipline. Schedules that matched tides, caches that shifted weekly, and passwords that changed with the moon. Their powers rested on supply chains that reached from Antwerp to Lyon, from Geneva to London, and from Venice to ports where barges met mule trains. False imprints turned Lyon into Basel with a line of type, while watermarks shifted identities like masks at a carnival. A master printer who controlled fonts and paper could feed friends and starve enemies with the same delivery wagon. The ledger that recorded stock became a map of influence when a quiet donor paid for a press run that no bishop expected to see. Notable figures stand on both sides of the threshold. Christophe Plantin built a lawful empire of type in Antwerp, yet managed a web of subcontractors whose side projects supplied markets that could not bear their own name. In the English world, stationers linked to recusant circles learned to bind small octavos that could pass a customs man's glance. Continental partners worked with sympathetic booksellers in fairs at Frankfurt and in back rooms, where an invoice written with an innocent title concealed a list that buyers knew how to read. These names show that the printer and the smuggler often shared the same bench. The darker methods appear in the margins where survival demanded nerve. Title pages were forged to misdirect raids, customs men were bribed to glance at the wrong bale, and informers were blacklisted with a swiftness that taught caution to the curious. Rivals accused certain houses of planting contraband on competitors to ruin them, while magistrates claimed that presses shifted addresses with every rumor. The charge of blackmail surfaced when a seized correspondence exposed who had paid for which tract, and the mere threat to reveal such lists persuaded many to remain silent. Their legacy fills modern habits that treat free words as arteries of public life. Secure couriers, whistleblower archives, and the careful art of timed release all echo those river routes and night wagons. The underground printer taught Europe that ideas can survive any barricade if friends agree on a meeting place and a signal that fits in a pocket. 1532 AD Accademia degli Intronati and the Theatrical Academies. In Siena, a club of witty minds learned to move a city with laughter that cut like a blade. Who were the Intronati and their sister academies across the peninsula? They were patrician circles and learned playwrights who adopted emblems, nicknames, and rules that bound members to a standard of style and secrecy. A playbill revealed very little. The work happened in chambers where scripts were rehearsed, roles were assigned, and meanings were tuned to land on target without leaving a fingerprint. Their powers flowed through culture that looked innocent to the unprepared. Satire placed a greedy usurer on stage who resembled a rival so closely that even children snickered at the comparison. Casting choices elevated families by giving them clever roles, while villains were drawn with features that only insiders recognized. A season of productions became a referendum on taste and policy, because audiences learned what to admire and what to despise from jokes that seemed harmless in the moment. Notable names in the Intronati roster hide behind playful titles, yet the pattern is clear. Sienese patricians used the academy to showcase talent, to coach heirs in public speaking, and to set a social calendar that engines of state could not ignore. In other cities, academies with radiant titles recruited dramatists whose comedies traveled across courts, making reputations for authors and for the houses that backed them. The stage turned into a school for governance by teaching rhythm, timing, and the weight of a pause. Whispers about darker tactics multiplied whenever a role hit too close to a living person. Reputational assassination through coded caricature became a common complaint, and more than one magistrate discovered that a season of jests can bruise harder than a fine. Behind the curtain, alliances formed over private readings where scenes were cut or added to flatter a patron or to warn an enemy. Quiet threats appeared as punchlines, and a man who laughed along with a joke that mocked him saved face but lost ground. The modern echo is easy to hear in media that shapes opinion through entertainment. Writers' rooms, closed previews, and private notes from backers still guide what the public sees and what the public learns to feel. The theatrical academies proved that a scripted evening can guide a city more gently and more firmly than a decree that begs to be mocked. 1583 AD, Accademia della Crusca and the Language Guardians. A country that speaks with many voices begins to crave a standard, and in Florence, a circle of scholars took up a sieve as their emblem to filter speech. Who were the founders of the Accademia della Crusca? They were language custodians who guarded usage, fixed meanings, and chose which words would carry prestige. Their meetings were closed, their ballots were secret, and their decisions made printers nod or grind their teeth. The first principle to grasp is that a dictionary can become a throne when schools and courts bow to its pages. Their powers rested on canon formation. A vote inside the academy could lift an author into classrooms, while another vote could keep a rival's prose out of reach for a generation. Printers depended on official lists to sell editions, and playwrights trimmed lines to fit the temper of the arbiters whose judgments traveled further than any single book. When standards harden, commerce follows, and that is how taste becomes policy. Notable members include Leonardo Salviati and lexicographers whose names now live in title pages that governed reading in the 17th century and beyond. They wrote entries with examples that taught not only meaning but tone, and they distributed honor by deciding which authors counted as models. Friends received generous citations, and enemies discovered that omission can be louder than insult. A scholar in good standing gained students, and students became fans who purchased whatever bore the Academy's blessing. Opponents accused the academicians of hiding politics in definitions, of excluding dialects that belonged to citizens as much as to poets, and of leaning on printers to keep dangerous or unfashionable works out of stock. The charge of blackmail rarely stuck here, yet the charge of leverage arrived often. A line in a preface could signal that cooperation would bring praise in the next volume, while resistance would bring a long silence in the index. When vocabulary becomes a gate, the gatekeeper learns to enjoy the keys. The lasting imprint of this work appears anywhere. A style guide rules a newsroom, or a standards board approves a term for law or science. Language academies taught Europe that words can be governed like roads, and that whoever maps the routes of speech controls how thought travels. 1521 AD, Order of the Golden Fleece. A chain of gold around a noble neck looks like honor, and it is, but in the Habsburg century, it also worked like a leash that led straight to a sovereign's chair. Who were the Knights of the Golden Fleece? They were the chosen elite, bound by rights, chapters, and an oath that promised service to dynasty and rule to conscience. Their gatherings were ceremonial on the surface and intensely practical in the rooms where chapters met without servants. Their powers were bound to access. Members stood close to dukes and kings at banquets, in campaigns, and in councils, and that nearness turned personal loyalty into public policy. A candidate for command could be blessed by a chapter vote, while a rival learned that his name had been tabled without explanation. The order became a funnel that channeled favors to those who wore its collar and invitations to those who wished to wear it soon. Notable figures range from Charles the Bold in the late Burgundian age to Philip the Handsome and Charles V as the order moved into Habsburg hands. Grandees whose voices could calm provinces accepted the collar with reverence and a clear eye for advantage. The roster reads like a blueprint of power across the Low Countries and the Spanish realms, and that is no accident. The order gave princes a way to bind quarrelsome lords to a shared script. The darker practices surfaced in the politics of membership. A hint that a candidate might be blackballed for past hesitations could bend a vote in a provincial assembly. A whisper that a knight's conduct would be discussed in chapter could soften a stance on tax or levy. Blackmail rarely needed a letter when honor stood at stake, because a blush in a great hall can punish more than a summons can. Silence pacts after contentious meetings kept the stories inside, which only fed the myth that everything important was decided where trumpets could not be heard. Modern honor systems still draw from this well. Decorations bind elites, orders gather influence, and ceremonies maintain networks that outlast cabinets. The Golden Fleece demonstrated that the language of virtue can tether ambition so gently that the ambitious thank the hand that holds the rope. 1607 AD, early operative to speculative Masonic lodges. A craft that built in stone learned to build in trust, and that transformation changed social life far beyond any quarry. Who were the early lodges as they shifted from operative stonemasons to speculative fraternities? They were working guilds with passwords, grades, and marks that began to admit educated patrons who loved the symbolism as much as the skill. The meeting became as important as the site, and the minute book began to matter as much as the plan. Their powers were humble to the eye and mighty in effect. A lodge controlled who could claim competence, who would be recommended for a commission, and who would share in relief funds when illness or accident struck. As speculative members entered, the circle gained new resources and fresh ambitions. Discussions expanded from wages and ashlar to virtue and governance, and that expansion created bridges between tradesmen and gentry that few other rooms allowed. Notable figures in Scotland include William Shaw, who wrote statutes that disciplined lodges with clarity and foresight, while in England, patrons found that an evening among Masons offered fellowship without the sharp edges of court intrigue. Clergymen, lawyers, and merchants learned a grammar of ritual that used square and compasses to speak about fairness and restraint. A fraternity that had once guarded secrets of line and curve began to guard secrets of mutual respect in a world that needed more of it. Allegations arrived with growth. Hiring cartels were said to punish independent masters who refused to join, and private votes were accused of hiding political talk that could not be spoken in public taverns without consequence. One whisper claimed that lodge charity bought silence from men who might otherwise testify in hiring disputes, while another claimed that the new speculative brothers used the lodge to cement deals that the guild never intended to mediate. A society that values discretion always risks being painted as a conspiracy by those who stand outside the door. The enduring result is a global culture of lodges that mix philanthropy with fellowship, craft memory with civic ambition, and ritual with relief. The passage from operative stone to speculative symbol shows how a working code can grow into a social ethic, and how a quiet vote can lead to a public good when trust gathers under a roof. Why these secret societies still matter. The echoes of those rooms shape daily life in ways that feel natural only because we inherited their patterns. Inner cabinets meet with printed agendas that never cross a public desk, and chiefs of staff translate ambition into schedules that decide which promises survive the week. Philanthropic boards allocate fortunes with ballots counted far from cameras, and their minutes read like the statutes of an old confraternity. Research groups embargo results until patents are signed, while editorial committees decide which voices enter the canon. The social grammar forged by the Renaissance teaches institutions to speak softly while changing the weather. The balance between secrecy and service remains the central test, just as it was when a Venetian council weighed in exile. Confidentiality can protect delicate negotiations or conceal favoritism, and discretion can shelter conscience or shroud convenience. Whistleblowing inherits the courage of underground printers, while anonymous denunciation risks the vices of informant webs. Modern auditors, ombuds, and parliamentary committees exist because earlier centuries proved that secrecy without supervision invites decay. The lesson is stern and hopeful. Privacy works when responsibility walks beside it. Education may be the most enduring channel of influence, and it flows with the patience of a river. Jesuit colleges refined the idea that a syllabus can equip leaders for a lifetime, and university seminars still resemble academies that curate access to rare knowledge. Language councils taught the world that dictionaries are policy tools, and style guides still govern what appears in court filings and classrooms. The invisible college that Rosicrucian readers imagined lives on in networks that share datasets and methods with selective openness. Schools and societies have traded costumes, not functions. Finance learned the same script and never forgot it. Closed partnerships still lend to states and shape budgets when bond markets move, and private ledgers still decide which projects begin and which must wait. Regulatory meetings turn on briefings written by hands that also know the balance of risk and reward. The Fugger calendar taught money to behave like a sovereign, and the modern calendar agrees more often than it admits. When debts mature, policies follow. Culture carries the softest tools and the longest memory. Theatrical academies once trained elites to command mood, and today writers' rooms perform the same service for wider audiences. Honors systems bind professionals with ribbons and letters after names, and orders of merit continue to frame public virtue through ritual. Meanwhile, small faith communities and conscience-driven networks preserve the right to gather without fear, a right learned from people who lit candles in cupboards and taught children to remember the words. The line from quiet devotion to modern privacy law is straight enough to trace with a fingertip. You can sense the living legacy in your own life if you look for its signatures. A meeting with no notes that leads to a major decision, a closed list that controls who reads a memo, a charity vote that reroutes a scholarship, a committee that selects a standard for a profession. These are not shadows to fear by default. They are structures to measure. The Renaissance did not teach the world to hide. It taught the world to organize what it hides so that action becomes possible. The real question for any age is simple: who keeps the keys and who checks the keeper? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ominous history content. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next one.